the so last class period we were talking about imperialism and colonialism, and we saw the map of how European powers, after they stopped slavery, kind of then went into occupying territories, peoples, colonizing them, controlling them, extracting their resources, imposing new government. And so if you think about the 20th century, so we have made our way to the 20th century, this is kind of what we'll be talking about. What were the realities of the 20th century? What kinds of modernities do we see? And so we have talked about some of these things. They will be familiar to you. For example, the Japanese change their systems very rapidly and they become sort of major power. There are countries that don't change their systems, like Russia, and so they go into the 20th century with some vestiges of feudalism and so on. And so what we'll be thinking about is three patterns of modernity after World War One, their emergence, and we briefly mentioned those three patterns, the strengths and flaws of the three visions of modernity. So, for example, if you think about fascism, they were about taking over countries and a lot of race-based policies. So, for example, eugenics and so on. And then we'll talk about supremacist nationalism, which we see mostly in Japan. It's also present in Spain and in Italy, and sort of see what happens to that particular vision of modernity. And so, for example, if you think about the Japanese, the vision that we can attribute to them is modernization. So Japan modernizes, they adopt constitutionalism, even though before that they were kind of like ruled by an empire and a shogun, and they didn't have parliament and samurais and so on. But Japan also industrializes very quickly. But it's also important to think about the countries that did not do these things. So, for example, China did not adopt modernity. It takes on some elements of modernity. So, for example, People's Liberation Army, but that didn't come into place until like 1949. And so, when we think about these visions, we see constitutional democracy that is paired with nationalism. Now, in Japan, this was known as Kokutai. So the essence of being Japanese, it's probably not an easy sort of vision to understand, particularly because the Japanese had an emperor, and the emperor was everything. Your life was dedicated to the preservation of emperor. And so if you sort of think about that as being the highest ideal, that goes against democracy, because democracy is about we the people. So, but you have an emperor who is everything, and you would die for them. But so this is sort of like, so the Japanese saw the emperor as an organ of state. He is the state. And so if you remember what Louis XVI said, he made the point that he was the state and the state was him. You can't separate those. And so this is sort of what the Japanese vision was. And if you said something against the emperor, for example, Minobe, who was pretty well known in Japan, Minobe was almost assassinated a few times. So in Japan, you couldn't say some things about the emperor of the country, and so that is one of the visions that we see. And so the people who are trying, so think about the John Locke and his writings on democracy. So he's probably the equivalent of Minobe in Japan, and so he is trying to figure out what is the emperor, what is the state, what is the relationship between the state and people. But so Japan had this very unusual modernity of the emperor is everything. We are going to industrialize. We are going to have these major conglomerates, but everything works for the preservation of the empire. So these are the three main visions: constitutionalism, capitalism, industry, and democracy. So that's kind of one modernity or vision of modernity. And so you can sort of see what countries were in there. Now, we can discuss whether the US was a democracy before 1920 or maybe before 1965, and what really constitutes a democracy. But we can also ask the same question. So, for example, Great Britain, which owned all these colonies, and so it's sort of like, are you more of an imperialist or a democracy? But you see, their systems based on capitalism, on industry, industrialization, and democracy. And so the challenges that come with that, we see them. For example, racism, imperialism, having second-class citizens. And so what does this speak to democracy? We also see supremacist nationalism. So this is the second vision of the three main visions of the 20th century. So as I mentioned, elements of this include elevating the state above all else. So for example, think about Nazi Germany. The state was everything, but also when the leader of the state becomes everything, so Hitler was the Führer, he also becomes everything. He is not an emperor, but you can sort of draw a direct line between Hitler and the fascist state and the nationalist Japanese state. But supremacist nationalism was actually in many places, so Italy, Japan, Spain. Now, the third vision was communism and socialism, and as we have seen, it came into, Russia was the first country to be run under communism after the October Revolution of 1917. And so that begins in 1917, ends in 1991. China becomes a communist country, or the communists win in 1949. There was a civil war after the Second World War. We probably might talk about that briefly. But so World War I begins in 1914. It's interesting when you ask Americans about history and the history of some things, like when the Second World War began. You might hear people say 1941 because of Pearl Harbor. But so, for example, World War I, the United States enters in 1917. But by then, the war had been going on for 3 years, and we saw some of the reasons why it. Now, so World War I was called many things. So the Great War, the Patriotic War, the War to End All Wars. And so part of there were many reasons. There's like 10 reasons why World War I began. Even though the event that began World War I was that assassination that we talked about. But so we see some of the outcomes of the First World War. And of course there were, two camps, Allied powers, Central powers, but there were also neutral powers. So it's kind of three sides. But so one of the outcomes of the First World War was the destruction of the old order. The Ottoman Empire, Prussia, Germany, but actually if you look at a map of Germany, it's still, like in 1946, Prussia was still kind of part of Germany. We also see the beginnings of, I wouldn't say the beginnings of international organizations, because we had the Red Cross going back to 1864. But we see the beginning of organizations that are dedicated to world peace. So the League of Nations is founded in 1920. Now, World War I really destroyed lots of places and things, particularly in France, which saw most of the fighting. So majority of World War I was in France, but it was in other places too. For example, when we talked about imperialism, we talked about Africa, East Africa, Germany losing her territories in Tanganyika, in Cameroon, I think they also lost Togo, and lost other colonies in the East Indies. So there were there were there was fighting in other places, but the majority of the war was in France, and you can sort of see the moonscapes that dotted the landscapes of the First World War. You can see some of the machinery, soldiers going to the front, and so it's actually said that the trenches were about like it was about a 9 mile front. Like that's what people were fighting for. And so we will mention some of these things over and over. But so World War One is caused by a number of things, as I mentioned, maybe 10 reasons, including, for example, ethno-linguistic nationalism. So the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, we'll see that in a minute, was about Serbians being able to run their government. So Serbia becomes independent like in 1878, but it's still controlled by Austria-Hungary on behalf of the Ottoman Empire. So the Ottoman Empire is collapsing, and it has this other neighboring empire and says, can you watch the Serbs for us? But the Serbs think they should be independent. And so one of the things that they think will happen is to assassinate the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Now, sometimes when you assassinate countries' leaders, those countries go to war. And so this is what the Austro-Hungarian Empire decides to do. It's like, you assassinated our heir to the throne, or we are going to fight you. And so when we think about ethno-linguistic nationalism, but we also think about markets for raw materials and finished materials, strategic advantage. So like you want to control certain places. Here's an example of this. So if you look at a colonization map of Africa, you will see where these powers had their small colonies or major colonies. But you also see very unusual, and the US is guilty of doing this. So for example, think about Guam. Guam is a US territory. It is nowhere near the US. In fact, it's off the coast of Africa. Well, not really off the coast of Africa. But so you also see other countries like the French. They control Reunion Island, which is near Madagascar. The British control what they call the Falklands Islands, or what the Argentinians call the Malvinas Islands. And so if you think about where Britain is and that island, it's like, why are you even there? But so this is the strategic advantage, but also national prestige of, yeah, we have colonies, we are an imperial power. We shall talk about alliances and how these cause the First World War, how they sort of contribute to the First World War. But alliances were very important, and I'm sure you have heard of talk of alliances, whether the US should should be in NATO. These are the kinds of alliances that we are talking about. So the US, for example, has alliances with Australia, New Zealand, and the UK. And so if you're a country and you attack any of those countries, the US is coming to fight you. The US is in NATO, and so this is another example of... now, the problem with the alliances of the First World War is because they were sort of like two countries, like the US and Canada, or US and Mexico, or say Mexico and Cuba. And so if the US does something to Mexico, Cuba is at war with the US. But there were other reasons. So imperialism, markets, expansion of the Germans, but also this ethnic nationalism. It's sort of like, they're Germans over there, we are going to get them. And so we expand into that country. There were also other things like revenge. So for example, the French, we talked about the consolidation and expansion of Germany. So Germany expands in 1871 and takes French territory. Now they take the most productive French territory in terms of iron ore, which is used to make steel, which is used to make ships. And so the French want their territory back. But so what the Germans do, instead of giving the French their territory back, they say, well, there's all those colonies out there. You can go and get some land out there, which the French do, but they still want their stuff back because it's, there's like French people. So Alsace-Lorraine, they wanted it. Now, the Ottoman Empire had a lot of challenges. So, for example, the Greeks become independent. Russia is still trying to dismantle the Ottoman Empire. And the other imperial European powers are still trying to do the same. And so, as I also mentioned, the status of Bosnia and Herzegovina and whether they would become independent or not. Now, this is where the Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated by a group that called itself the Black Hand. So it was the Austro-Hungarians said it was a terrorist group. Gavrilo Princip, who fired the shots that killed the Archduke, said that it was a liberation movement. So, the power of stories, who is telling the story. But this is a bridge where he was assassinated. That's him. That's the car that he was riding in. And so again, think about industrialization. Think about new technologies. So this was the short heard around the world. And so what happens when Archduke Franz Ferdinand is assassinated, because he was assassinated in Bosnia and Herzegovina, the Austro-Hungarian Empire says, well, it makes certain demands of the Serbs. They, a whole bunch of things. We want to control your government. You need to stop these movements. You need to give us the people who did this, and we are going to probably assassinate or execute them. So this is generally referred to as the July ultimatum. So Austria-Hungary says, you need to do these things within a month. So the Archduke is assassinated on June 14th, 1914. And so the July ultimatum says you need to do these things. But then Serbia says, well, we can do some of them, but not all of them. For example, we are not going to allow you to control our government. But also, we have a friend we can call to fight you. And that friend was Russia. So now it's going to be a war between Austria-Hungary and Russia. And then everyone begins to call their friends. But so these are the causes of the First World War. So talked about nationalism, territorial disputes, and contested territories like who controls Serbia. Secret alliances, the balance of power was changing, so Germany was becoming too powerful. In fact, when you look at the structural causes, Britain had the largest navy in the world by 1914. And so the Germans decide, we are also going to build a navy that is going to rival the British. And the British are thinking, but why are you building a navy? Are you planning to fight someone? So these, even though there were other reasons, countries were still competing for influence and power and, those kinds of things. There was also what we think of as misperception of intent. So, for example, with these alliances, eventually Germany would have to fight Britain. And these were trading partners. They were like what the US and China are to each other. And so, now 100 years later, we are talking about, can the US fight China, especially if all the US people's stuff comes from China. And so people didn't think that Germany and the UK would fight, but also there was an expectation of a very short war. Remember, the Archduke is assassinated in June. Everybody thought the war would be over by 1914 December, but it actually took another 4 years. There were diplomatic miscommunications. For example, the Zimmermann telegram, the arms race. So everybody was building weapons, as we mentioned, the British, for example. There was imperial and colonial rivalry. So, even though they had decided on effective control, there was still taking over of colonies and territories. And then there was no systematic way to resolve grievances. Now, this is a map of Europe before the First World War. And so you can see the kingdom that was Germany and Prussia going all the way to near Russia, Austria-Hungary as the empire, and then the Ottoman Empire down here. Now you can see Serbia is shown as independent, or at least a country, but it was still controlled by Austria-Hungary. And so this map is going to change dramatically, because if you think about the map, really like Austria-Hungary, how many different ethnicities lived in Austria-Hungary? So of course you have Hungarians, you have Austrians, you have some Germans. And so again, if you sort of think about, like literally if you look at that map, Germany and Austria-Hungary, you ask yourself, where is Poland? And so Poland was somewhere in there. Where is Latvia, Lithuania, and other many countries? And so this nationalism caused people to want independence, and so this is part of the. This is a better map of the maybe the alliances. So the Triple Alliance, the Triple Entente. So sort of like who was with who, and you can see, for example, the United Kingdom, France, and Russia, and Japan were on the same side. There were, the Triple Entente, which, the Triple Alliance, which included Italy, Austria, Hungary, Germany. Now, the First World War, even though it was a global war, is often thought of as the war that involved cousins. Now, and actually, Germany's Kaiser, which is sort of the equivalent of emperor, was Kaiser Wilhelm II. He was the cousin of, I think, at that time, British had a King George. So these two are cousins. And they're also cousins with Nicholas II of Russia. So it's sort of like, the British and the Russians are on the same side fighting their cousin. So it's, some of these wars were probably highly unnecessary. Now, this is another view of the complex alliances, and so this actually does tell you of the ethnicities that were in there that were trying to become independent. So you have the Czechs, Italians, Slovenians, Croats, Serbs, Romanians, Ukrainians, Poles, and Slovaks, and of course Austrians. And they are all under this one empire, but they've been seeing countries becoming independent, and so they're like, why can't we become independent? And so this was probably Serbia's biggest argument. Now, the war included colonies. And so, like, people who you would think were not necessarily really involved. So, for example, Australians and New Zealand, also called Anzacs, they come to fight in Europe. And, sort of think about 1914. It's not a time when you can literally fly to, like, you're taking a ship the long way to go fight in Europe. And you're fighting for what? But also now think about the British Empire. So the British Empire, which included the dominions of Australia, Canada, New Zealand. And so these are, including even Indian troops and West African troops and all kinds of troops. So you see very diverse peoples fighting. And sometimes it's sort of like, why are we even fighting? Like if I was Australian, I'd be like, okay, I understand that we are part of the British Empire, but why are we fighting again? Now, so this is a brief view of the mutual defense agreements. So now, remember, the war begins in Serbia. So Serbia is like, yeah, we could do the July ultimatum, but we could also call our friends the Russians. Now, so Russia is allies with Serbia. Austria-Hungary, whose prince was killed, is allies with Germany. Now again, look at Russia and Serbia, but also France and Russia. So if Russia goes to defend Serbia, France can go to defend Russia. But also you see Britain, France, and Belgium. So now this brings in Belgium and Britain on the side of Russia and France. And, all these countries are going to be involved. And very interestingly, Japan. So in 1905, I think the British and the Japanese signed a mutual defense treaty. And you're like, Japan is like way over there and Britain is like way over here. Why are you having a defense treaty? And so Japan is going to be involved, but Japan's goals are different because they actually wanted to dismantle China. Like they want to take over China. But ironically, China is also on the side of France and Britain. And so it's sort of like we are on the same side, but we are fighting you. Very strange. But so this is what triggers the war. So Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia after Serbia declines to allow or to fulfill the July ultimatum. So Austria-Hungary is at war with Serbia. Russia now comes to defend Serbia. So because Russia is at war, France is also at war. Now France is fighting Austria-Hungary, which is also allies with Germany. And so now France is actually fighting Germany. And Germany and the Ottoman Empire are on the same side. So now the Ottoman Empire is also fighting on the side of Germany, Austria-Hungary. So it gets complicated really quickly. And then Britain enters because it's going to defend Belgium, and it's also allies with France. So it's sort of like now everybody is in there. Now the US and Italy will enter later. But this is kind of why we're talking about the First World War. Now, so the idea of the First World War was technology, speedy mobilization. And so, for example, Austria-Hungary wanted to defeat France before Russia could get its troops together. But Russia gets its troops together very quickly. And so Germany is now fighting like on two fronts. But we shall probably not talk about the specific battles. This would take years to, but so this is part of so Germany is at war, and of course it's fighting France, and so instead of just going straight across the border, it goes through Belgium, which means it has invaded Belgium, which means the British now have to come in and help their allies. Now, during the First World War, sometimes countries did things that were very sketchy. So, for example, the Ottoman Empire, which is coming apart in many ways, decides that one of its enemies is Armenians who are inside of the Ottoman Empire. And so now, as I have previously mentioned, if you're American, you cannot say Armenian genocide, especially if you are anywhere near close to Turkey. However, there was a genocide in 1915, and it's estimated that more than 1 million Armenians died because apparently they supported Russia against the Ottoman Empire, and so they were, it was a mess. We did talk about the early war, the early course of the First World War, Austria-Hungary trying to win against France before Russia mobilizes. But the Ottoman Empire is defeated. The Russians are stopped. And so actually the outcomes of the First World War for Russia kind of trigger the revolution. So the Russians are like, why are we fighting in France? Why are we fighting Germany? And why are we dying in so many numbers? Now remember, Russia is one of those countries that did not really modernize very well. But we begin to see sort of new countries joining because they're like, well, I could get a piece of territory. The First World War is a technological war. But it's also a trench war. So, as I mentioned, most of the war was fought in northeast France, this region. So, east of Paris. That's kind of where most of the war is fought. This is where the trenches are. And, to me, if you actually study the First World War, it becomes a little stupid because it's sort of like, really, all we are fighting for is like a few yards of trench. But also, and you may have heard of trench foot. So think about these soldiers. They live in these trenches. There are rats. It's wet. They are doing all their business in there. So these are not really like good places to be. Trench foot was very, and so people's feet would rot, and that is probably not good for warfare. You see the use of newer weapons. So, for example, the use of chlorine gas. Remember, we have come out of the Industrial Revolution, so people are using various technologies, but also chemicals and other things. Now, the irony of, and I think there's nothing that shows this better than this image. These are gas masks. But also, it's a little ironic that you actually have to put a gas mask on a mule. Now, remember, this is trench warfare, and your trench is probably 1 or 2 miles away from the other side. Now, imagine you throw a bunch of chlorine gas at them. Now, it's going to probably kill them, but what if the wind shifts? Now the chlorine gas is coming back to your trenches. And so it was this an incident that is highly publicized. So during Christmas in 1914, the soldiers who were in these trenches declared some sort of truce. Christmas Day, let's stop fighting because Jesus. And so they actually get out and go into the no man's land, which is what the space between the trenches was called. And they start playing soccer, and they share meals and drinks. But the next day they're expected to start fighting, and so they actually refuse to fight. Because it's sort of like, why are we fighting again? So technologies, the machine gun, we have talked about the machine gun. We briefly mentioned the total war, which is a warfare in which all the resources of the nation or nations, including most of the population, are preserved, or they are applied to the war effort. So this applies to all sectors of society, including, for example, if you are so the Second World War is what really shows this idea of total war. So think about women who went to work in factories because the men went to fight at the front. And so literally everyone is involved in the total war. As I mentioned, there were troops from different places. So, for example, Indian troops, so 250,000 Indian troops served. Now, this was kind of the Trojan horse thing, because a lot of these colonial peoples did not have the weapons or the training to fight their colonizers. But now you have recruited 250,000 Indian troops who are going to fight for you. When they come back, what do you think they are going to do? And so this is actually mostly what happens during the Second World War. Now, I thought to include this maybe graphic to sort of illustrate some of the key points of the 20th century. So the First World War that we're talking about. We did talk about the revolution in China, maybe not broadly. A Bolshevik revolution in 1917, the Ottoman Empire, the Armenian genocide. And so, for example, you see this textbook refers to it as the massacre of Armenians in the Ottoman Empire, as opposed to the genocide that occurred in the Ottoman Empire. We mentioned the Treaty of Versailles. We shall probably talk about that a little. Stock market, Japanese annex Manchuria, New Deal, Spanish Civil War, Rape of Nanking, and then the Second World War, which I think we shall talk about now. So the First World War had some turning points, and one of these major turning points is 1917. So Russia leaves the war. It signs a treaty that is called the Brest-Litovsk, Litovsk Treaty. So it signs this treaty with Germany and ends up losing about a third of its territory, which is sort of like, that is a terrible outcome. Now, the reason that Russia leaves the Ottoman Empire, leaves the war, is because the fighting isn't going well for Russia. Lots of peasants are dying. Conditions in Russia are terrible. And so Russians are like, why are we still... But also, if you remember when you talk about Russia, there was a lot of movements towards independence or revolution. And so 1917, there are actually two revolutions in Russia. And Russia kicks out Tsar Nicholas II, who is the cousin of King George and Kaiser Wilhelm. And so the Bolsheviks come into power, the Russians, the communists come into power. Now, the other major event was the entry of the United States into the war. And so the US enters the war partly because of technology. So two things, as we saw on the Kahoot. One is the Zimmerman telegram. So the Zimmerman telegram is, at that time, many countries communicated with telegrams. And so Germany sends Mexico a telegram. So the foreign minister of Germany was called Zimmerman, and so it's like him who sent the telegram. So he sends it to the Mexican embassy in Washington, D.C. But the British intercept this telegram. Now, they don't give it to the Americans. They're like, you know what, this is an ace that we're going to keep. And so they keep it for a minute. Now, until Russia is now threatening to leave. But one of the other elements of technology that we should think about is submarines. So submarines first show up actually during the U.S. Civil War. They were not very effective, and many people died in those trials. But so the Germans had perfected submarines, and they were active in the Atlantic. And one of the ships that they sink is the Lusitania. The Lusitania was a sister ship to the Titanic. And so it is sunk by Germans with the loss of life of 215 Americans. And so the US is very angry about this, and they're like, we are not even in the war. Why are you sinking our people? And we should fight you. But the US does not. Now, in 1917, the Zimmerman telegram, now together with the sinking of Lusitania, caused the US to enter into the First World War. So this is maybe a depiction of the sinking of the Lusitania, and the text of the Zimmerman telegram. The text of the Zimmerman telegram is actually very interesting because Germany tells Mexico, remember the Mexican-American War you lost, like maybe 60 years ago? What if we could help you fight the US if you help us fight the Europeans, maybe? But actually, what the Germans wanted was for the US not to enter the war, because then they probably would have won. And so how do you make sure the US doesn't enter the war? If they're fighting Mexico, maybe they're not going to enter the war. But that, of course, didn't go very well, backfired. The US enters. And so Woodrow Wilson was the US president during the First World War. Woodrow Wilson was a good diplomat, I think, but he was a terrible human being. He was the first to screen the movie The Klansman in the White House, which is sort of like Why are you screening the Klansman in the now? So he is internationally kind of known, and if you remember a few years ago, George Floyd and the backlash that it sort of taking down racism, and Princeton, I think, renamed their Woodrow Wilson School of International. But anyway, so Woodrow Wilson was the president, and he made a speech in which he outlined 14 points. It's actually called the 14 points speech. And so, sort of like what was going to be expected of a peaceful world. So the 14th point actually was the creation of an international organization, which is the League of Nations. But anyway, so we should say the war went on for about 4 years. Began on, some people say it began on July 28th when the July ultimatum expired. Now, it ended on, and you probably have heard of Armistice Day, November 11th of every year. We celebrate Armistice Day. So, November 11th, the 11th hour, so usually about 11 a.m. So that was the official end of the fighting. But of course, the Treaty of Versailles would actually be the one that was signed to end the war. And these are the four major figures who were at the Treaty of Versailles. Ironically, Germany wasn't invited, so even the war guilt clause, they were told, yeah, you're guilty and you will pay us reparations, and you don't have anything to say about this. We shall see how that causes challenges and leads to the Second World War on Tuesday of next week.